I was told at school to be ashamed to be British. We were evil people who had this terrible empire. Netanyahu has shown himself to be one of the greatest leaders that the world's ever seen.
The UK has agreed to transfer sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius.
I think it was a big mistake to sign that treaty in the first place. What are we going to encourage these people to fight for? We're going to encourage them to fight for a country that doesn't take its own defences seriously. Our politicians are undermining the defence of our country. The biggest problem with our national defences today is a lack of strong political leadership and political will to defend our country and to stand up for our country. We're going to encourage people to fight for a country that doesn't even protect its own borders from wave after wave of illegal immigrants. When you look, for example, at the condemnation of the United Nations of Israel, repeated condemnation, and then look at what their response has been to the widespread killings in Iran. They've been pretty much silent on that. President Trump is building up a massive military force in the Middle East.
30 to 40,000 American troops are stationed across 8 or 9 locations.
We're braced for what may happen. The only two people know the real answer to that, and that's President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu.
I'm Jonathan Sacerdoti. If you enjoy these conversations as much as I find them interesting to have, then please make sure you like and subscribe, and that way you'll hear about new conversations as I publish them. Col Richard Kemp, thanks so much for joining me. The last time I saw you back in June, we ended up in a bomb shelter in Tel Aviv, and that was during the 12-day war with Iran. Do you think we're about to see day 13 of that war kick off?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to join you again, Jonathan, albeit maybe not in quite such immediate circumstances. But yeah, I think, as we all know, President Trump is building up a massive military force in the Middle East with the presumed intention of striking Iran. My guess is he's unlikely to build up that force and then not use it. He might not have made his final decision yet, and that decision could change even if he has. But he, as we recall back in the dim, distant days of his Venezuela operation, he built up a significant force there and then used it. So I think we can probably expect to see something like that here. Obviously, the initial prompting to do this was caused by the uprisings in Iran that have been going on for a few weeks since just before the end of last year. Now, they seem to have, to a large extent, died down at the moment, albeit mainly only temporarily. And what that does, I think, is it probably removes pressure on the US to act very quickly. I think those forces that are there can stay there, I wouldn't say indefinitely, but they can stay there for a reasonable length of time while President Trump assesses and decides what he wants to do, while the intelligence picture is developed in terms of the targets that he might want to hit, and also while diplomatic pressure is put on the Iranians. Because, of course, a massive buildup of forces, which you know to be direct to you, really does focus the mind. And it will be focusing the mind of the Iranian regime, because their number one priority is the preservation of that regime, the survival of that regime above everything else. And so I've no doubt that behind the scenes diplomatic pressure is being applied on top of the military presence in order to push the Iranians in the direction that President Trump wants them to go. And as far as he's concerned, it seems to be, from his public statements, that his priority is to get Iran to basically to do away with its nuclear weapons program and make an agreement to that effect publicly. But that seems to be his priority. I would doubt that would be something. I mean, if I was in his position, shall we say, I wouldn't ease up on my pressure on Iran because they said they're going to do something. We know what that regime operates like. We know that if they say something, agree to something, undertake to do something, we can be absolutely certain that they will do whatever they want afterwards. So I wouldn't rely on any agreement or undertaking by them to ease off on the pressure on them.
I mean, just to talk about that build up. I think Marco Rubio said 30 to 40,000 American troops are stationed across 8 or 9 locations in the vicinity, all within reach of an array of thousands of Iranian one-way UAVs and Iranian short-range ballistic missiles. And he painted that as a threat to the American troops. And so he's not ruled out any preemptive defensive strike, even as he put it, or a defensive strike if Iran chooses to do something. So yes, all that pressure, and there is still this discussion of whether or not there could be some kind of negotiation. But that then leads people to wonder, obviously there's no element of surprise this time round, or at least there's a much lessened element of surprise. Maybe no one knows exactly when or what the Americans will do, but there's a fairly big clue something might be coming. But what to the Iranian uprisings? Because the people of Iran have been promised help is on its way, but we've seen a massive number. I mean, we can't know exactly, but some reports saying 30,000 killed in a couple of days at the beginning of the protests. So, what should they be making of the American position?
Well, I think saying help is on its way, I don't think President Trump had the levers at his disposal to actually stop the killing. And I think, for one thing, there weren't the US forces that were required in order to do that in place straight away. So I don't think he could have achieved maybe what people hoped he meant by saying help is on the way. I think he probably had it in a slightly longer term time frame. But I think there's not much. Well, I say there's not much doubt. You should never say there's not much doubt when you're talking about a war or conflict, because it's always very uncertain, and the outcome is never really clear, and the consequences aren't clear either. But I think the likelihood is that if there is a significant strike against let's say the top level of the regime, Ayatollah Khamenei himself, his deputies, the IRGC senior people, and other key elements of the regime, that could lead to regime collapse. It could do. We don't know for sure it will. And I think that's probably the best thing that those people who've been rising up in Iran can hope for, giving them an opportunity to put something else in place of what's there now. We shouldn't forget as well that I think that uprising, although there was quite a significant delay, I think that uprising was directly due, not as the BBC would like us to believe, to inflation, but due to the 12-day war itself, to the weakening of the regime, the humbling of the regime, and showing the people that the regime could be toppled, potentially could be toppled. And I think that basically precipitated events we've seen in the last few weeks. Of course, there have been many uprisings in Iran before, but I think that's what the proximate cause was for this uprising. You touched a bit on preemptive action against the potential for Iran to use its drones, its ballistic missiles, and its other capabilities in sea, for example, against the US forces. And it's not just against US forces. I mean, Iran, I think if it fears that it's going to fall, is likely to, or be attacked, shall we say, is likely to lash out also at Israel and potentially other countries within the region as well, but certainly Israel. And therefore, of course, a key element of Trump's operational planning would have been to wait until Israel essentially said, we are ready we're braced for what may happen. And that would require the redeployment of a number of assets. I was in Israel myself a few days ago, and there was certainly indications of movement of assets. And it's not just defense against Iran, but we shouldn't forget that Israel will need to protect itself also against Lebanese Hezbollah, which they have severely downgraded but not destroyed. They still have a capability, and their capability of firing ballistic missiles and other forms of attack into Israel, rockets, they retain that capability. So I think, if we are about to see a strike by the United States against Iran, I think maybe we could expect to see some form of more intensive preemptive action than we've seen so far against Hezbollah and Lebanon as well.
And of course, Israel still hasn't firmly dealt with the Houthis, who are aligned with Iran and backed by them. So that could be another area potentially for retaliation from the Iranians, aimed presumably towards Israel as well as US troops. But I wonder as well how you see Israel taking part in a potential strike then. So if the US does decide, either preemptively or in response to something the Iranians do, to mobilize more, well, to start actual strikes, do you think Israel will sit it out this time? Last time, last June, Israel did the work at the beginning, and then the US came in and kind of cleaned up at the end with what Trump seems to favor, which is a short, sharp shock where America knew it wasn't getting entrenched in something it couldn't get out of. It seems very different now for both sides. So will we assume that they'll kind of split the targets between them? Or do we think that Israel will sit back and let the US take care of things? Do we have any clues as to what would be the better and more likely strategic outcome at the moment?
I think probably only two people know the real answer to that, and that's President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And maybe people like Marco Rubio and the Secretary of State for War of the United States. And there are opposite numbers in Israel, but very few people will know that. People can speculate, talk about it, etc., but they don't really know. I mean, my guess is, and it is only very much a guess, is that Israel will have been very intimately involved with US CENTCOM in planning whatever action the US are considering against Iran. And the reason I say that is because, of course, it has to be coordinated with Israel's own defenses, but also, perhaps even more significantly, Israel probably has by far the greatest intelligence handle on Iran of any country in the world, and the US will be relying upon that. And, again, this is pure speculation, but I would be confident there are elements within Iran of Israeli special forces or Israeli intelligence services who would both be providing up-to-date intelligence, but also maybe being ready to take some form of action on the ground themselves. But as far as the sort of the major actions concerned, which I would have thought is most likely to be attacks from the air, and I wouldn't exclude the possibility of ground attacks as well on a limited scale with special forces, but I think the main strike is more likely to be from the air. And Israel will be involved in queuing that up and helping with the targeting. I think probably it is less likely that Israel will take an active role in airstrikes on this occasion, and I think that may be for two reasons. I mean, I would guess the Americans have sufficient potency in the region to do what they need to do without Israeli assistance. But if that is the case, then I think the reasons Israel wouldn't join in, except maybe in an unexpected situation, is, first of all, there's a difference. I think in the minds of the people in Iran, there is a difference between an American strike on their regime and an Israeli-American strike. And I think we've seen quite a lot of evidence that many of the people who are involved in the uprising are not as strongly anti-Israel as the Ayatollahs themselves are. But nevertheless, it might potentially be damaging to their cause if Israel is seen to strike prior to the assault on this regime. I don't know that for sure, but I think that's possible. And the other thing I think is that I think maybe President Trump might like to say, America did this, I did this. If it happens the way he hopes it happens, maybe I brought down this regime. And obviously that's, that kind of presentation is pretty important to him.
Yeah. Well, again, many of us have been wondering, exactly what the US aim might be. So you mentioned earlier the curtailment of all nuclear activity, the surrender of any nuclear material, the end potentially of ballistic missile manufacturing, giving up the actual missiles themselves. All of effectively the latest ask from the Americans is so great that I think we know the Iranian regime will never accept that. And that seems to be why some kind of war is maybe inevitable or seems inevitable. When it comes to regime change, though, you mentioned that there's the potential to take out the Ayatollah, there's potential to take out senior IRGC people. what would come next? I think that's one of the worries that many people have. Nobody quite knows what would follow. Would Trump push for a Venezuela type situation where you just take out those at the top, but you actually end up then using that leverage to negotiate with the same tyrannical regime, with the IRGC take over? Or do you think it will be a complete downfall of the regime and therefore liberation of the Iranian people, but for who knows what to take the place of the previous regime?
Well, I think either of those options is a possibility. It depends, obviously, on the success and the power of the strike that's delivered as to exactly how much damage it's done, and how fearful the remaining elements of the IRGC are of them being next themselves. And that's obviously a key consideration. I think that the big question, of course, in everyone's mind, and I've spoken to a lot of Iranians, I've spoken to a lot of people who know and understand Iran much better than I do, and no one really has an answer as to how things might unfold. There doesn't appear to be any form of united opposition to the regime. There's various different elements, and some of them are against each other, of course, but there are a number of different elements. Probably the one name that we've heard spoken about more than any other, certainly in the West, is the Crown Prince, the former Shah's son, Pahlavi. Whether he, I've heard estimates that maybe he's got something like 25% of the public support in Iran, which could be significant and could be enough. But exactly how he then is able to, let's say, on a temporary basis at least, take control of the country is really hard to understand. I think that the different factions, I don't think any single faction there among the oppositionists is strong enough to actually, as far as I know, and I could be wrong here, strong enough to actually seize control if the regime falls. But I think the one, you mentioned the IRGC taking over. Well, actually, the IRGC is pretty much in charge now anyway. So as you said, it would be maybe a more of a Venezuela type thing, where a continuation of the current regime, but with an understanding that they are going to work to the agenda of the United States, at least for a bit. The only other element, I think, of the in Iran that may be able to take control immediately would be the Iranian army, as opposed to the IRGC. And there were some people speculating that the army could turn against the regime as the uprisings developed in the last few weeks. That didn't happen, and there was no indication of it happening. But it is a possibility, because I think that many of the upper echelons, and probably the lower echelons as well, of the Iranian army are not regime-supporting fanatics, and they might welcome the fall of the regime and being in a position to take over themselves. I don't know if they could do that. I think that, like I said, they're the only element in Iran that probably has at least some of the capability needed to do so. And that would be, again, we'd probably be facing then more of a Venezuela type situation, but with the army in charge as opposed to the current regime fully in charge. We do know that, or at least as I understand it anyway, I don't think anyone who claims to be a real expert on Iran should be, except for some Iranians, should be listened to that closely. But certainly, as I understand it, there has been quite a lot of loyalty towards the Shah himself and the memory of the Shah, shall we say, and perhaps even towards his son among the upper echelons of the army. So I think I'm afraid I'm not really able to answer your question more clearly than that. I think we really will have to wait and see, unfortunately.
Yeah. And when it comes to potential military action, you mentioned Israel and the US, of course, but will the UK be part of any activity? I know that the UK has moved some aircraft into the region. Will we expect to see the RAF taking part, do you think?
I think we might do, but I would be surprised if the RAF took part in offensive operations against Iran. I think the likelihood is that the RAF planes that are now in Qatar, as I understand it, at the US base there, would be used in defense in the event of the Iranians lashing out. And let's not forget, certainly on the first occasion on which Iran struck Israel, the Royal Air Force was involved then in the defense of Israel against that attack. So we could see something similar this time round. And don't forget as well that we have British military installations in Cyprus, which would be in range of some Iranian systems. And so they would have to be not necessarily the ones in Qatar, because there's an RAF base in Cyprus as well. But they would have to obviously have in mind the potential for an Iranian strike on British facilities in Cyprus.
So if we move away from Iran now and look also at what's going on in Gaza, obviously we saw at Davos that Board of Peace presentation, and we then saw the Americans pushing towards phase 2 of the Trump point plan for Gaza, which is really towards rehabilitation and rebuilding, but in return for disarmament of Hamas, which has still not taken place. And I think that many people were about to hang Benjamin Netanyahu for not having managed to get back all of the hostages before that took place. But then right at the last minute, Israel pulled off that incredibly impressive and emotional action where they did locate the remains of the last dead hostage, exhumed, identified those remains, and then restored them to Israel, to his family. So that does, in a way, pave the way for the Rafah crossing to open and all of those things. Now, what do you make of what's going to happen there? Because it seems really, to not my opinion, to quote some of the actual hostages themselves who've been more outspoken now, there's nobody left at all. Aid levels going into Gaza seem to be massively swelled, much more than perhaps is even needed, I've read. There have been some hostages saying that the aid should be stopped. I read another hostage saying now there's nothing left there of hostages or even remains of hostages. Israel should just be bombing the place more. Do you think Israel's been pushed into this? Do you think it's going to go smoothly? Can you imagine this plan working where they create safe areas for some Gazans to be re-educated, rehomed? Or is this all just a bluff on America's part? And if so, what's actually going to happen?
In the ideal world, Hamas would basically stand down and disarm itself. But I was going to say we don't live in the ideal world. We live in the real world, and the chances of that happening, in my mind, are relatively low. In fact, I think even just today or yesterday, one of the Hamas leadership made it clear that Hamas had not agreed to disarm and wouldn't be disarming. And I think we've heard that from many of the Hamas leaders since the current ceasefire deal was agreed upon.
Yeah, I've got that. Musa Abu Marzouk told Al Jazeera Hamas has never agreed to surrender its weapons in any form. Any arrangements concerning the Gaza Strip must be made in consultation with Hamas. I mean, so statements like that make it pretty clear, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the only way of getting them to disarm themselves would be, I think, by pressure from Qatar and Turkey, who are two of Hamas's most important allies. So I think if some kind of pressure can be applied from those quarters, diplomatically I'm talking about now, I'm not talking about military action, then that is a possibility. I don't see it as a particularly strong possibility, but it is a possibility. And allied to that, I think we also need to not ignore what we've just been talking about, which is Iran itself. And of course, Iran is also maybe the key sponsor of Hamas. And I think one of the reasons why Hamas agreed to the current ceasefire was because of the 12-day war, was because of the strikes by the US and by Israel against their key sponsor, and was also because of the strikes by Israel against Qatar, against Hamas leadership in Qatar, which is another spot. So I think those things had a big impact on Hamas's decision to go along with the ceasefire, which otherwise they may not have been inclined to do. So again, if we now see a significant assault on the Iranian regime and possibly the toppling of that Iranian regime, that also could potentially contribute to Hamas basically saying they'd rather live to fight another day. I don't know. I don't think anyone can know that. But short of that happening, short of pressure from either events in Iran from pressure from Iraq or Turkey, then the only way I believe that Hamas is going to be disarmed is if the IDF go and disarm them. The so-called stabilization force, which as far as I know doesn't exist at the moment, and there's no immediate prospect it will exist. But if it does, it's not going to disarm Hamas. No other country in the world, not even the United States of America or anything, has the power, and certainly not the will, to get into Gaza and deal with Hamas as they need to be dealt with. Only Israel can do that. And it may be that Israel eventually does have to do it. But the timing for all that could, obviously, Netanyahu, I think, has been keen to allow events to unfold in Gaza. But first of all, getting all of the hostages back, and secondly, giving time for President Trump's peace agreement to potentially work. So that obviously has been a factor. And then that the timing for an Israeli operation in Gaza could be dependent on what happens in Iran and with Lebanese Hezbollah. But I think with all of those moving parts, I think we're likely ultimately to see Israel going in to finish off Hamas. And we're talking, people say, oh, well, they couldn't do it in 2 years. How can they do it now? Well, first of all, they did it in 2 years. They did immense damage to Hamas, immense damage. They're not anything like the organization they were before. But we are in a different situation. You mentioned it. There are no hostages in Gaza. That completely changes the situation inside Gaza as far as military operations against Hamas are concerned. And I think we could well see a situation in the coming weeks, or maybe a bit longer, whereby Israel, the IDF, move in strength into Gaza and squeeze Hamas from every different direction until they're forced maybe into a small area which can then be placed under siege. I mean, that sort of thing is a possibility before actually moving in and finalizing it. And I think we saw in the attacks on Gaza City just before the ceasefire broke out, which many people around the world, including some people here in the UK, some so-called experts here in the UK, said Israel should not go and deal with Gaza City because it would be too big a bloodbath. But actually, it was another big contribution to Hamas deciding to fold on the ceasefire agreement, was the fact that they saw this machine closing in around them and guessed that their days would be numbered, and they didn't really want that to happen. So I think we might see a replication of the same kind of thinking as with Gaza City in the parts of Gaza that are now under Hamas control.
Right. And I think you've hinted at it there a few times, that people say, oh, well, if Israel couldn't do it in 2 years, how will it ever get done? But, up until a few days ago, they said the same about returning all the hostages. And tragically, many were dead, but they did get back every single hostage, dead or alive. And so perhaps this second supposedly impossible war aim or promise may be actually achievable in the same way that the hostage one was. I do wonder if you have anything to say about Benjamin Netanyahu's recent remarks regarding the Biden administration. I mean, he said just recently to his political opponents within Israel that Biden had effectively throttled Israel during the 2 years of war, and that Trump has been, I suppose, a godsend in that respect, because he actually allowed Israel to carry on and finish things off far more as it needed to. Do you think that is a fair assessment on Netanyahu's part, that the Biden administration, whilst being very supportive at the beginning, and certainly America did continue to supply Israel with a lot of what it needed, it kind of got in the way a bit, let's say, at one point, and even caused the deaths of more Israeli soldiers?
Yeah, I think Netanyahu is right. There were two factors in why Israel's operations in Gaza took so long and didn't come to a decisive conclusion so far. And the first factor is what Netanyahu said, which is the lack of full support from the United States. Now, the United States gave immense support to Israel, immense support. It gave them a huge amount of weaponry and various other forms of assistance, but it also did hold Israel back. It did its best, for example, if we recall, to stop Israel dealing with Rafah, which was an absolutely fundamental element of the campaign. and it delayed that operation for quite a long time. So what and the United States also did withhold some critical armaments from Israel. So yeah, I think Netanyahu is right on that. And the second factor, of course, is the one that I spoke about just now, which is the hostages. And the presence of those hostages really did shape the form of Israeli operations. They couldn't unleash what they needed really to unleash, with the likelihood or the possibility that some of those hostages were going to get killed. Well, that doesn't exist anymore. Biden doesn't. Well, Biden still exists, but Biden is not in a position of influence now. And I think, certainly my understanding is that President Trump, if Israel decides it has to go in and deal with Hamas finally, President Trump will be right behind them in allowing them and encouraging them and facilitating them doing so. But I think the when you mentioned Netanyahu, Netanyahu has shown himself to be one of the greatest leaders that the world's ever seen, in my view. And when you look at all the challenges he faces and the difficulties he has, and the opposition from President Biden to some of the things he wants to do, the even stronger opposition from some of the other allies of Israel, including the United Kingdom and other European countries, and not even thinking about the internal situation within Israel. The fact that he had his aim in sight. He said at the beginning he was going to get all the hostages out. He said at the beginning he was going to destroy Hamas. He hasn't finally destroyed Hamas. He's certainly got all the hostages out. And I think Israel should be very grateful. I think that they've got that particular leader in that particular position at this particular time, because I can't think of very many other politicians anywhere in the world that will be able to withstand all those pressures and still push forward to achieve the objectives that he set out.
Yes, and the ability to balance so many different tensions, whether it's been the US, other, as you said, other allies around the world with varying degrees of support at different points during the war, to balance the internal pressures in Israel, the domestic pressures politically, absolutely. And as you say, all at the same time as balancing the need to be in court several times a week on domestic corruption trials. So I think it has been an extraordinary thing to watch, even for those who may not like the man. There is no denying that even in his 70s, he's proven to be extremely resilient, very laser focused, and very strategic in how he's acted. And Iran has always been the big Netanyahu promise or aim to deal with. So maybe yet he will also get that. I mean, the 12-day war certainly made a very big dent in that. And in that respect, he will be going into the upcoming Israeli elections, possibly even hoping to win again after October the 7th. Many people would have written him off. You did mention Turkey and Qatar earlier, potentially being able to put pressure on Hamas to disarm. Do you think that America and more broadly the Western tolerance or sort of embrace of Turkey and Qatar is going to come back to bite us afterwards? Because, Qatar has had a very important part in supporting and funding Hamas over the years. Indeed, the preparations for October the 7th, in the run-up to all of that, there was money with Israel's knowledge going that way from Qatar to Hamas. Turkey has these sort of neo-Ottoman ambitions in the region, trying to get a foothold both in Syria, just north of Israel, and in Gaza, in the south of Israel. These are obviously big worries to Israel. They don't seem to be as big worries to Donald Trump. Do you think this is perhaps a short-sighted approach on his part?
Well, I don't know, to be honest, what Trump thinks of Turkey and Qatar, or indeed what his advisors around him think of that. But I think he's probably wise to not kind of round on Turkey or Qatar, but to maybe to use his diplomatic talents to get them to operate according to the way he wants them to. And I'm thinking not in the long term particularly, but in terms of the immediate conflict. And I think, the use of Qatar and Turkey against or in relation to Hamas, shall we say, I think is potentially a valuable thing. But whatever we do with whatever, and that includes the UK, whatever any of the Western countries does in its dealings with Iran and with Qatar and Turkey, we need to go in with our eyes open, and I'm afraid we haven't always done that in the past. If you remember, David Cameron tried to get Turkey into the EU, which would have been, I think, pretty catastrophic. That they're troublesome enough as a member of NATO as it is, a member of NATO, that we can't be sure which side they're really on, whether it comes to dealings with Russia, Ukraine, or any of the other major challenges that NATO faces today. So, but I think we should keep our eyes open, and we just need to look at what they're doing in Syria. I mean, Syria is to use a well-worn cliche, is a bit of a powder keg at the moment. Yes, we've got a degree of stability there, but Turkey, I think, is doing all it can to prevent, let's say, the Kurdish elements in Turkey being in any way unified with the government in Damascus, and there were efforts. I think there were thoughts of incorporating the SDF in some way into the Syrian armed forces, which Turkey has strongly come out against. I mean, Turkey does not want to see the Kurds in any kind of a strong position within Syria at all, and it will do anything it needs to do, militarily or otherwise, to prevent that happening. Which I think we have to be aware of, and we have to do whatever we need to do, I think, or whatever we can do, and maybe there's not very much, to support the Kurds while at the same time not totally alienating Turkey. And I think Turkey has bigger ambitions than just Syria. You mentioned a neo-Ottoman empire. I think that's without a doubt is what Erdogan's got in his head. And I think it was a couple of years ago now, maybe less, he himself said that Jerusalem, for example, belongs to Turkey. I'm not saying he's got an aspiration to march on Jerusalem now, but he's certainly got, I think, his eye on Turkey becoming more powerful, partly, not exclusively, partly in a way that will be able to fill a vacuum left in various places in the region if the Iranian regime falls. And Qatar, as for Qatar, I think again, we have to maintain some form of relations with Qatar. We do recognize, at least I recognize, the immense harm that Qatar has done and is capable of doing in the region and elsewhere in the world. If you think about the huge amount of influence Qatar has within the UK and the US as well, I think we need to be very guarded against that. But they do have uses, and I think Netanyahu himself said that he won't have Qatar or Turkey forces in Gaza or in a position to influence what's happening in Gaza. And I think he's absolutely right about that. And I suspect that President Trump, they may not say so, I suspect he probably agrees with that as well. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be used in whatever way they can be for the kind of diplomatic pressure to be exerted that I mentioned before.
And in a sense, that seems to be Trump's pragmatic agenda, which is to say, things don't necessarily have to be perfect. In fact, they can't be. So best use the allies you can in the way that you can. And in a sense, he's sort of sidelined some NATO allies and some European allies and even the UK at times, because just don't seem useful in pursuing the goals that he has. I mean, that seems to be what the whole Board of Peace agenda is about. Instead of just constantly criticizing or fighting the UN, just build a potential replacement and start operating on that basis. It seems to be the attitude. I mean, do you think that's why he's willing to start something like the Board of Peace with apparently countries who you might not think of as being the best first candidates to join it? They're the people that matter. They're the people with influence at the moment on the fronts that he cares about. Is that what he's doing?
Yeah, I believe it is. And I think he will. I mean, I don't know what the constitution of the Board of Peace is. I've read the various documents, but what he really has in his mind, we don't know. But I would imagine to him it is simply an instrument by which he can influence world affairs through this body. And I think those people who are members of the Board of Peace at the moment, and maybe the ones in the future, are people who see it, who basically see, or who he sees, shall we say, as being people that he can manipulate through the Board of Peace. And you know, people like Putin, who was offered a seat on it and I believe turned it down. I don't know if Xi was in China was ever offered anything, but you know, they're clearly not the same type of people that can be manipulated through this means anyway. So yeah, I think it's I would guess it'll be relatively short-lived. I don't know. I mean, I think President Trump is decided he's going to be the Board of Peace president for life.
Forever.
So maybe I don't know how he's going to live, but maybe it will go on. But I think it's certainly a very interesting way of doing business, and I think we'll have to see how things unfold as to whether it actually does turn out to be of real use. And one thing I can say about the United Nations is that it is not of real use. So there is something needed, whether it's a Board of Peace or something different, something needed to coordinate and unify elements who have similar interests in the world, rather than simply allow the world to be, or the United Nations anyway, to be run by basically a group of people who are predominantly anti-West. And when you look, for example, at the condemnation of the United Nations of Israel, repeated condemnations, not just during the war, the recent war, but many, many years before that, and intensifying in the war following 7th of October. Look at all those condemnations lashed out by the Secretary General and various other people in the UN. And then look at what their response has been to the widespread killings in Iran. They've been pretty silent on that, which really does show you where their real agenda lies. And so I think something needs to be done to form a body that would be more effective in their place. And it may be the Board of Peace is that, at least for the time being.
Going back to Syria for a moment, it does seem that, again, it's one of those strange balances that's being played with. So the idea of al-Jilani is somehow tolerable, when not that long ago there was a massive bounty on his head as a jihadist with evil intent towards the West, towards America. Now he's apparently our friend. And as you mentioned, the Kurds, the treatment of the Kurds in Syria seems that, again, a minority group who until now we respected and who were a useful allied insurgent group, are now being thrown under the bus. Are these just necessary, difficult, pragmatic decisions that have to be made, or is it a betrayal of the Kurds and to some extent the Druze in Syria? Is the West failing these minorities in its embrace of people like al-Jilani?
Well, I think in a way the West is failing them, but on the other hand, one has to ask what actually the West can do about it, and what the West, including the UK, is just not in a position to take any form of decisive action to help the Kurds or any of the other minorities in Syria, and has never done so, really, with the exception of the US to an extent. But I think the treatment of Jilani, as I understand it, I think Trump is probably, again, has taken the right route there. In other words, he's kind of bigged him up, albeit he was an Al-Qaeda leader in the past and probably still is, really. But I think Trump has an immense amount of power, an immense amount of wealth, which Jilani needs. And I think I would guess Jilani's priority is going to be to keep Trump happy, and hope that he's going to get more economic assistance for Syria in doing so. I would guess. I can't see into Jilani's mind, but I would guess his priority is to hold onto power in Syria and to do that by hopefully by starting some form of economic development in Syria. And for that, he without a doubt needs Trump. And of course, the other thing we shouldn't forget is why it's important that we, to an extent, kind of work with people like Gilani, is because if we don't, then we know other countries that will certainly do so and will certainly gain influence there, including particularly, of course, China and Russia.
Also in the region, there is now a sort of increased tension between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And these are two useful allies of America and the West more largely. And we saw that strike in Yemen, actually, which was sort of escalated that tension between the two. And now we hear that Saudi Arabia, which had been on the path to potential normalization with Israel before October 7th, 2023. It's now moved away from that. Do you think this is a sort of temporary strategic blip, or do you think it is actually something more worrying than that we need to be concerned about and figure out a way to handle going forwards?
Well, I think there's a number of factors, particularly involving Saudi Arabia. And they have, in recent days, the Saudis have reasserted their influence over the areas of Yemen that are not under the Houthis' control. And that, there was that clash between, indirect clash between the UAE and Saudi. But I think that's now died away. And as far as I understand it, the UAE have pretty much withdrawn their forces from Yemen and basically left an open playing field for Saudis to deal with the recognized government of Yemen. But from the wider perspective, I think Saudi, as with most Arab countries, and probably with every country in the world, actually, we shouldn't necessarily, I don't think, treat as gospel, if I can use that word on your show. We can't treat as gospel the word of the public word of any of these countries. And Saudi, I think Saudi has a pretty close relationship with Israel these days, has done for a number of years. At one point, it was sort of lining itself up to become part of the Abraham Accords. And of course, the Abraham Accords themselves wouldn't have happened if Saudi hadn't given the UAE in particular the green light to go ahead and do it. But that, as you said, that is looking maybe a little bit more difficult now. I don't know if the messages coming out from Saudi are the real representation of the Crown Prince's intent, or if it's just posturing for whatever reason he might have. But the other thing I think to bear in mind when it comes to Saudi, one of the main reasons why Saudi was so close with Israel, and it really was and still remains pretty close with Israel, is because of the fear of Iran. And I think we may have seen, as a result of the 12-day war, we've seen that fear of Iran diminishing, not just in Saudi, but around the region. And if this strike we were speaking about earlier on, if that happens, then it may be diminished even further. And thus giving Saudi less reason necessarily to at least publicly, to align itself or ally itself with Israel or establish normalization. So I think it's quite a complex position. The other factor, of course, which sort of works in a different direction, is how strong Israel is now. Israel today is significantly stronger than it was on the 6th of October or the 7th of October. And Israel has shown itself to be effectively a pretty much unbeatable military power in the Middle East. And I think the Saudis will have admired what Israel did with Iran. They will also have admired what Israel did with Hamas and with the Houthis, and with Lebanon, with the Hezbollah in Lebanon, of course. I think that, the Saudi will, and countries, leaders in the Middle East, they, in the way that we in the West may not, they respect and appreciate strength. So on the one hand, you've got a slightly contradictory situation where on the one hand, you've got maybe the motivation for Saudi to get closer alongside Israel, given its strength. On the other hand, you've got maybe a disincentive for that, given what Israel has done to Iran and what the United States may do to Iran.
Absolutely. And in that respect, I think you're completely correct, of course, about Israel having restored its reputation militarily in the region. I think it's garnered an enormous amount of respect, even from its enemies in the Middle East, which is something it had to do after October the 7th. Moving slightly aside from all of this, when Donald Trump said that NATO allies had stayed back from the front lines in Afghanistan, how did that make you feel as somebody that was actually involved with the British troops in Afghanistan? Obviously, I read your piece in the Telegraph. It's not true what he said, and he has since somewhat reeled it back in with a tweet or a statement, I think probably on Truth Social rather than Twitter. But what do you think Trump is doing when he says things like that?
Well, I think a lot of people in our country were understandably outraged by it. Both the supporters of the armed forces and soldiers soldiers, sailors and airmen who'd fought in Afghanistan were pretty stung by his comments, and understandably. But my view is his comments were not directed in the way they thought they were. In other words, I don't think he believed that British troops had hung back from the front line, and his Truth Social post clarified that that wasn't what he meant. I think his comments were aimed at the political leaders in European NATO countries, who in some cases most certainly have hung back, and even some of the countries that sent forces into Afghanistan kept them very far away from real danger. Not all of them, but some of them did. And I think it was probably a very poorly thought through and poorly worded attempt to have a dig at the politicians' lack of will to fight for their country or get their countries to fight for NATO, rather than a jibe at the NATO forces themselves. But the problem with his clarification that he made on Truth Social was that he kind of focused only on the British forces, and didn't by implication that suggested that all of the other forces concerned were the ones that hung back, and that includes Canada and Denmark, neither of whom hung back, and both of whom actually made immense sacrifices, their troops did, in Afghanistan. So it was good for Britain, but it maybe not so good for other allies. But I think that was the point. He was
Maybe made it worse even.
Yeah, it probably did. But I think his tactics of swatting at European allies, well, we may not like it, but I think it works. And we've gone from an alliance, a NATO alliance, that most countries weren't even willing to contribute the mandatory 2% of GDP to their defenses, now to the point where many of them have increased significantly their spending. And in some cases, they've, I think maybe in all cases even, they've said most cases, they've said they'll increase to 5%. Whether that happens, I think, is another issue. But at least he's got things moving in the right direction. You can't put that all down to him. I think you can put a lot of it down to him, to his approach towards NATO in term one and also in term two. You can also put it down to the war in Ukraine. I think that has focused the minds of quite a few European leaders as well, which is shown our weakness. The Ukraine war really has shown Europe's absolute weakness, and in my view, a failure of NATO, because NATO made Ukraine this was the cause of the hour, and yet didn't do as much as it needed to do to keep Russia at bay. I'm not saying NATO could have done anything which would have pushed Russia out of Ukraine, but at least we could have contributed a great deal more, and we failed to do so. So I think that, and I'm sure Trump is well aware of that as well. And I don't see him. I mean, to round up, I don't see him as being anti-NATO. I don't think he's against NATO. I think he's against NATO being freeloaders on the United States of America, which I am as well, I have to say.
Yeah. Well, another area of Trump UK disagreement's been the Chagos affair. So the UK has agreed to transfer sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, but that handover has been delayed and it's politically unstable now because of the UK parliamentary resistance, but also because of that sharp opposition from President Trump. I wonder if you've got anything to say about that, because the UK signed that treaty in 2025 to cede sovereignty of the entire archipelago to Mauritius. That's a sort of loss of British sovereign control over a critical Indian Ocean base. And understandably, Trump is dead against that. I mean, he's spoken out, calling it an act of great stupidity and total weakness. What do you think is going to happen? Is Keir Starmer going to have to climb down on this?
Well, I think it was a big mistake to sign that treaty in the first place. And I do blame the United States to some extent for that, because I don't think the US was vocal enough about it at the time it was being sort of finalized. I think if the US had come out more strongly then, I think then the treaty may not have been signed. I think we can attribute that perhaps to disconnection between the State Department, which seemed to signal a go-ahead for the treaty, and the White House, which didn't seem to have anything to say about it. So whether it was that the White House was focused elsewhere or not, I don't know. But certainly since it's come to the attention of the president, he's spoken out strongly against it. It would be, to actually go ahead with it would be a major error, because Diego Garcia, which is part of the Chagos Islands, Diego Garcia as a base has been used, and is being used right now as part of the forced buildup of US forces to the Middle East. It is a critical strategic location. And while Keir Starmer might say, yeah, but we've got a 99-year lease or whatever is on it, on Diego Garcia, that's not really the point, because it exposes that base to a number of threats, one of which is that, yes, we might hold on to Diego Garcia, but it might allow that this handover of the Chagos might well allow some of Mauritius's allies, China and Russia, to develop their own close-by infrastructure, which could threaten that base. And also, I think it exposes, and I can't go into the detail because I don't know it, but it will expose Diego Garcia to potential inspections, international inspections, as a result of being part of the sovereign territory of Mauritius, which has signed up to a number of treaties that allow inspections, particularly nuclear-related inspections. So I think it's complex, and there are a lot of threats that come out of that to our strategic interests in the Indian Ocean. And I think what will happen, to answer your question, is I don't know. I mean, I would hope that President Trump will exert sufficient pressure on Starmer to stand down from it. There's another argument which I think the Americans might already have deployed, which is that actually that treaty that Starmer signed was in breach of international law, because we had a pre-existing internationally recognized treaty registered at the United Nations with the United States that Diego Garcia would remain under British sovereignty. So there are so many question marks around that. It was an unnecessary error, I think, for Keir Starmer to make. But having been critical of him, I think you could also be critical of the Conservative government before him, which was heading down the similar sort of path. They hadn't got to that conclusion yet. They may well have done. But I think in some ways it really indicates to me, in the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, a very weak approach to international affairs, where the leaders of the parties are not prepared to stand up for our national interests if there's some challenging of them or question mark in something like the International Court of Justice. We should be willing to stand up for our sovereignty and our interests, whatever the International Court of Justice might say. And by the way, the ICJ's ruling on Chagos was an advisory opinion, not a binding opinion.
Well, thinking along those lines, in another area of the ICJ and international courts, the UK's debate on charging troops is also heating up at the moment, with Labour's recent votes in January 2026 aiming to scrap the Northern Ireland Legacy Act's immunities and to bring back inquests. And at the same time, the Afghanistan inquiry keeps uncovering claims of SAS war crimes. So you've been quite a strong defender, well, there's a very strong defender of British soldiers on this. With Labour's recent moves to repeal the Legacy Act and strip away those immunities for Troubles era cases, how do you think that'll impact veterans who served in Northern Ireland? And does it risk reopening old wounds for political gain? And indeed, does it risk Britain more broadly in the international courts if it's doing these things itself internally?
It does. It does place immense risk against our forces and our country. And the Conservatives attempted, I'm not sure how successful it was, but they at least tried to stop a situation whereby effectively terrorists were being given free lunch or free pass, whatever it was, or get out of jail cards, with no risk really of them ever being hauled up to face the consequences of what they have done in the past. Whereas British soldiers who've been accused in the past, sometimes half a century ago, and cleared of potential offences, were then being dragged into court again. And we saw this repeatedly again and again and again. And there is actually, wouldn't want any of your viewers to think that there's a comparison between the misdeeds of British soldiers and the crimes of IRA terrorists and other terrorists, because on the whole, IRA terrorists went out each day with the intention of murder and destruction. British soldiers went out each day with the intention of preventing that from happening and putting their own lives on the line to do so in many cases. So there isn't a comparison, despite the fact that they've been treated relatively comparatively, apart from the get out of jail cards for the terrorists. I think you just have to look at the developments as well in Afghanistan and maybe even in Iraq. And I read a report in the Telegraph a day or so ago in which it was said that Keir Starmer himself, when he was a barrister, I think he was involved in cases along with I can't think of his name now, but a disgraced
With Phil Shiner.
Phil Shiner. I tried to erase his name from my head, but he was struck off from being a practicing lawyer because of the way that he tried to distort and corrupt the law in relation to attacks on British forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. Yet here was our Prime Minister now, Keir Starmer, working with this guy over legal matters affecting our troops, and also had written, I believe, I haven't seen it, but I'm relying on a Telegraph report, that he'd written at least a chapter in a book put together by Phil Shiner, saying that the European Court of Human Rights should be used against British soldiers accused of offences in Iraq and Afghanistan, rather than relying on British legal system. In other words, basically, our current Prime Minister saying, albeit a few years ago, saying the British sovereignty and British legal system should be usurped by the European Court of Human Rights because they would probably be harsher against soldiers in our legal system. So I think that all of those things, Northern Ireland, Iraq, Afghanistan, if a soldier commits either a criminal offence in the UK or a war crime in Afghanistan or Iraq, whatever it might be, of course they must be investigated, and of course if there's grounds, they must be tried and punished if they're found guilty. That goes without saying. But what we've got here is a situation where, as I mentioned before, in some cases soldiers have been cleared, in some cases repeatedly cleared by the courts, and yet the international system still wants to go against them. And all of that can only be extremely demoralizing for soldiers. not only for the soldiers who directly suffered themselves, but for anyone who is serving, thinking of staying serving, or thinking of joining the forces. This sort of action that is not necessary is very much against our national interests and against, I've said this before. I'm not aware of any government, and this goes for the Conservative government as well, by the way, not just the current Labour government, but I'm not aware of any government in history that has done so much to turn on its own soldiers from a legal perspective as successive British governments have done. It is disgraceful.
And in that respect, I mean, critics like Tom Tugendhat have argued that Keir Starmer's collaboration with Phil Shiner on those ECHR cases against British troops in Iraq has turned soldiers into whipping boys for the courts. So it is undoubtedly going to demoralise veterans who have served. Also, as you say, those in the military now, or those even considering joining the military and fighting for the country and its interest. And all of this at a time when you've pointed out that whether it's with the Chagos affair, or whether it's with general attitudes towards Donald Trump and his foreign policy, in a number of spheres, Britain is displaying its weakness. And it's at a time when most people think that we need to be getting tougher, arming up, tightening and strengthening our armed forces. Do you think that Britain is effectively completely undermining any future success in foreign policy and security policy for the years ahead? And to what extent is that, a result of this government, or in fact years or decades of previous governments just not prioritizing what was necessary in those departments?
I think it's the latter. I think this government and previous governments for decades, certainly since the end of the Cold War, have refused to spend adequate money on defense. They saw this kind of end of the Cold War bonus coming their way and dismantled a huge amount of our defenses, a huge amount, so they could spend the money on, predominantly, I think, on welfare, on the welfare state. Obviously, that needs money, but there's got to be a balance, and you can't take everything away from defense, or most things away from defense, to keep people on the dole, or to support illegal immigrants coming into the UK, whatever the use of this welfare is, and it's obviously very wide ranging. But you've got to have both. You've got, in order to support, in order for a welfare state to exist, the state itself has to be defendable. And we're getting ourselves, and have got ourselves over years, into a situation where we're not really defendable. We hear politicians today and previously talking about, and political leaders talking about we've got to be strong. We've got to be prepared for war. We've got to think about conscription comes up from time to time in various people's minds. Yet, what are we going to encourage these people to fight for? We're going to encourage them to fight for a country that doesn't take its own defenses seriously. We're going to encourage people to fight for a country that doesn't even protect its own borders from wave after wave of illegal immigrants. We're going to ask them to fight for a country that doesn't stand up for its own allies strongly enough, and I include Ukraine in that, and I also include Israel in that. I think the comment you made, I think, is right. Our politicians are undermining the defense of our country in so many different ways. And they can get, I don't believe for a moment that the government is going to put 5% of GDP into defense. I don't believe it. Maybe they will. I hope I'm wrong. But it really doesn't matter how much money you plow into it. If you haven't got the political will, the obvious political will, the known political will to stand up for your country, whether it be over the Chagos Islands, whether it be over soldiers being persecuted, or whatever it might be, you might as well not have these defenses, because they won't use them. And people like Putin and in Moscow and Xi in China and other people who have evil intent towards us will see these leaders, and they will see how weak they are, and they will see that, they might have this, they might have that, but they're never going to use it. So I think that's to my mind, the biggest problem with our national defences today is a lack of strong political leadership and political will to defend our country and to stand up for our country.
Even with 5% investment in defence, is it too late? I mean, it seems almost to be more than just about spending, which obviously is important. A cultural failing, that there is no culture of pride or defence of the borders, the nation, the people, the culture of Britishness. Is it a lost cause, or do you think that there is something that this government or another government could actually do in time to reel this back?
Of course, yes, there are things that can be done in addition to building up defence hardware. Restoring a sense of national pride, I think, is very important, as opposed to certainly since going right the way back, I was at school many years ago, long before you were born, Jonathan, in the 1970s. And I was told at school to be ashamed to be British, that we were evil people who had this terrible empire, and we shouldn't have Union Jacks and all the rest of it. It was very much the de rigueur back in the 70s. And if anything, it's got much worse now over successive generations. So there does need to be a restoration, in my view, of national pride. And that is increasingly important with the huge amount of immigration that's happened in the UK. And the same goes in other European countries, where our national culture and national identity is being diluted, very much diluted, and needs to be strengthened. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have immigrants coming into our countries, but those immigrants, they should be coming into a country that is proud of itself, that has a culture to be proud of, that it will stand up for, and they should then assimilate into that culture. But if you're coming into a country which is ashamed of its past and ashamed of itself, as I was taught back in the 70s, then what are you going to ask them to assimilate into? They might as well keep their own culture that they had back in the countries they came from and try and turn this country into that. I think that's one of the fundamental problems. I don't believe it can't be overcome. I think it can be overcome, but the question is, again, is there the political will there to do that among any party? And I can't see that there is.
To some extent, that is what many people feel is happening, which is, for there being a vacuum of some amount in terms of pride in Britishness and British culture, that there are waves of immigrants who are coming to establish or maintain their own culture as opposed to assimilating and integrating it into ours. So I think that is a bleak but very realistic diagnosis and prognosis. We are in interesting and distressing times. Obviously, we're all going to watch very closely in literally the coming hours and days when it comes to Iran, but also more broadly in all the things we discussed. There's a lot to think about, and I'm very grateful to you, Richard, Colonel Kemp, for speaking with me and unpacking a lot of these things. It's been incredibly insightful, and as ever, your overview is very, very valuable to many of us. So thank you very much for talking with me today.
Thank you, Jonathan. Great pleasure.